My research area involves condition health monitoring. So I'd like to share with you a meeting I had this morning with the folks over at the Computer Services in Durham about my brand new Dell Latitude, and it's got an attitude for that. And there it is. It's right there. See that little cover? That's what's called the bezel seal. The bezel is the inside of the top. The seal on the bezel has come loose. And I was going to pick super glue last night. But then I thought, you know what? I think I'll wait. Because if I super glue this, they might not ever be able to get the bezel off, and then my warranty will be void to boot. So I didn't, and I was right. So that's one small flaw for mankind. And here's another one. As long as we're talking about condition health monitoring. Oh, sorry guys. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, the battery's bulging. I think it's been eating too much. And it wouldn't be so bad if it were bulging in only one direction, but as many of you know, that ain't the way food works. So, if it bulges this way, it's probably bulging that way into the keyboard. Item number 2. So, and then of course there's the speaker, which I can't put above 50% because it crackles because it's broke. Item number 3. Hey, you know what? What kind of pickup truck would Jesus drive? Well, it'd have to be a Chevy, because he seemed to like to walk a lot. Okay. I like that joke. Alrighty then, let's get on with it. Alright, any questions on the homework? Come on, folks, it's due Friday. Don't do this to me, please. Don't wait until Wednesday. Somebody take the bullet. Cody, take the bullet. Ask a question. Fake it, even if you haven't looked at it. Fake it. I'll give you 30 seconds. I'm going to give you all 45 seconds to fake a question. So run to your homework real quick and pretend like you've been working on it for the last 3 hours and just don't get it. No, not how do you do. That won't work. Phrase the question in a more intelligent manner, please.
I would if Lenny was on my book. That's the fact that you want to do a printer that's on the Dell. The micro TV printer 4x4x4 cube is on sale for $350. He is excited.
Why are you that when I have you?
Phrase it properly. Phrase it in a clever way that makes me believe that you actually work.
I mean, hey, you're already necessary to include movie props.
Oh gosh.
Fair enough.
Just super glue them together.
Race to glue
Oh my god, no, you know what you could do is you could make, okay, so here's your cup. So we have from the side, do notches like this, so slide into each other.
Now that's a good thing.
Never use the pub. You slide new props in.
Yeah, that sounds terrible and terrifying.
I mean, what you're doing sounds terrible and terrifying. So, like, you're literally standing next to a very easy delaminated part. Do you acetone wash them? Why'd I even do this right now?
I'm posting today's
I'm gonna die.
lecture.
I'm gonna die to research.
Rachel, I thought my research was kind of scary.
Oh, mine's scary.
Yours is like you literally go around flying bullets.
Yeah.
And I do rock and roll. So you're in. That's not that.
No, but that's still scary if that comes at you.
Actually, I actually had a profit shield on me. It was, I was right as I was landing. And it was right as I was with a friend. Right as I was landing. My back dropped.
Here we are.
And one of the pieces
Homework
of
4.
his shoulder.
Cody. How long have you been working on this project?
Since last week.
Yeah. Hear that, folks? Last week. This man's going to be done the second half of this week. He didn't have to tell them. All right, what's your question?
Problem 3, part C.
Okay, 3C. Yeah.
How do you consider a step and a disturbance at the same time?
You don't.
Good answer.
You consider first the step by itself. I think he just created the principle of superposition. You should copyright that. Nobel Prize, or at least the Dumbbell Prize. It's been copyrighted a few hundred years ago. Yeah, superposition. Right? You turn off one input, so you have 0 coming from the disturbance, so it's a straight shot through, right? If you look at the block diagram, when you're computing the step response, this is 0. 0 plus anything is anything, so basically this just becomes a straight line. Correct? Now when you're computing the response to the disturbance, this becomes 0, so 0 minus anything is a -1 block here, isn't it? Right? It's a -1 multiplier. But you can take that -1 multiplier and simply subtract here, because then you have another negative feedback loop. Otherwise, this is positive, isn't it? We haven't done block diagrams like this. We haven't done those. What's the closed loop transfer function, Matt? What if this were negative?
Then it would be G over 1 plus G H.
Right, but now it's negative H. Right? Negative times subtracting a negative is a positive. So this is the same thing as this. Okay? In this picture, you have a positive feedback here. That's plus. This thing, unless there's a negative sign, it's plus plus. So you don't have negative feedback. But you have a -1 multiplier here. And then you're adding something times -1, which is the same thing as subtracting that something. So you can just take this thing and make it a simple line here and put your negative there, and then this is G and this is H. Right? So for the command transfer function, the forward loop is all of this. The feedback loop H is 1. For the disturbance system transfer function, the forward loop is this and the feedback loop is that. And that's how you use superposition now. So you'll have 2 feedback commands, right? Remember the simple way in MATLAB to get the feedback transfer function? Once you've defined, so in MATLAB the code would be this. GP equals TF 1, 1, 0, 0. Right? Because it's a 1 over S squared. S squared term is 1. The S, don't ever forget those zeros. That makes a huge difference. It's S squared plus 0 times, or S, 1 times S squared plus 0 times S to the 1 times 0 times S to the 0. These are really little mistakes, but they totally screw up an exam problem to the point where I have to then spend 20 minutes on a problem which you have trivialized, figuring out how do I grade you on such a simple little mistake, but having made that simple little mistake, the whole problem is a non-problem. So please try not to forget these zeros. What's the controller? Well, it's going to have a form. It's going to have this form. Right? So what is it? What's the s to the 1 coefficient? What is it? And the s to the 0? Anybody have a calculator? And what's in the denominator? What's in the denominator of that transfer function? Because you always, in TF, you have to give it a numerator and a denominator. What's the denominator? 1. Okay, so there's the controller. And then W sub C, the command transfer function, is feedback. GC times GP, and what's the feedback loop for the command? 1. I thought that was an outside answer. And what about the disturbance? GP. That's it. Right? No, I just went through that. Remember, this, when it's coming back, what's coming into here, which is going to be added into here, is a negative GC. But that's being added. MATLAB's feedback is always this way.
Yeah.
Well, there is no negative sign here. So you're giving MATLAB the wrong closed loop. MATLAB wants this sign here. If this sign isn't here, you can't give it to MATLAB. So you have to reframe this with a negative sign here, because it's a positive right now. This is this is positive. Unless there's a negative here, you add things, and then this is the sum of this plus this. So when you're looking at it as this in the input, and this is the feedback, there's a plus sign here. MATLAB doesn't like it. MATLAB is assuming it's a negative sign. When you give it G and you give it H, you're giving it this closed loop with a negative here, not with a positive. So how do you make that into a negative here? Well, what's coming back here and being added is a negative GC. So how about I just put the negative right here? Because adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting it, right? So put the negative sign here. This is gone, and this just becomes feedback. This line is solid line then, back to the feedback. Convince yourselves of that. This is pictorial stuff. This isn't even math. Right? If you put a -1 block in here, then what's coming here is the feedback theta times negative G, and then you're adding it to D. Well, D plus a negative G times whatever theta is the same thing as D minus theta times GC. That's negative feedback. That's the form MATLAB wants it in. All of these, in every book, in your book, in all books, this is what is called feedback. It's got negative feedback. That's why this is G over 1 plus GH, isn't it? If this is not here, you get this, you derived it. Right? Okay? So be really careful, because if you put a negative sign in there and it shouldn't be in there, you're going to end up with an unstable system, and I'm going to have to get my magnifying glass out and see, is this 10 to the 33rd or 10 to the 35th on its y-axis? Because it'll be an unstable system. All right? So then what's the next step here? As long as we're on a roll. What do you want to do? You want to superimpose. It's his idea. Come on. Superimpose the step response. So first, let's get the step response. How do you get the step response? Step. Which system? The command system. The disturbance is turned off, right? So you say step WC, and you will get a step, right? And then you look at the time frame of that step, because now for the disturbance, you don't have a sign W. There's a step input, and that's all. There's impulse and step. That's the only ones you can do. You can't do ramp. MATLAB doesn't have ramp of a system. Okay, so how do you compute the output of a, or generate the output of a system to a sinusoidal input? What's the command you need? You've used it in this course repeatedly. And certainly if you were in 355, you used it. How do you simulate an input through a system? LSIM. But LSIM requires you to specify the time over which you want the input, the form of the input, and the system. You already have the system for it, it's WD, right? Okay, the time that you need to simulate it over should be dictated by your step response time. So once you see that step response in your figure, you say, okay, Tback is equal 0:001 up to the same time interval as the step went to. And then you say U equals whatever it was, A sine omega t. And then you say LSIM T U WD after the hold command, of course. Right? Because you want to hold that first part. Any questions on that? Any other questions on the homework? Who else has been studying since last week? Anybody? All right, hopefully that helps to motivate you a little bit. If you have any final questions on Wednesday before the homework is due Friday, let me know. Let's get into the material of the day then, since you're all too shy to ask anything else. I was going over the material that we had covered last time and looking at the book, and I actually went online and looked at a couple other books. And I couldn't find any book that comes up with a clear procedure for doing lead compensator design. So let's review where we are right now. And I'll draw a picture of it. In fact, I'll draw a picture of what we looked at last time, which is example 6.5. Example 6.5 in the book, which is where we ended up last time, there was a plant transfer function, GP equals TF 10, 1, 1, 0, and then Bodie G. There it is. So this is the open loop transfer function. All right, after the steady state gain or steady state error issue has been addressed. So that was done at the beginning of 6 to 5. That's where the 10 came from. So this is the open loop Bodie plot, and now what we want to do is we want to design a compensator to change the phase margin. So what is the phase margin of the closed loop for this open loop? How do you get the phase margin of, let me put a grid on this thing. How do you get the closed loop phase margin from this thing? Remember, this gets back to root locus. The phase margin, you go to where the open loop gain is 1 and see how close is the phase to minus 180. But 1 is the same as 0 dB. All right, so you go to where the open loop gain is 0 dB. Let's say grid. You go to where the open loop gain is 0 dB and you say, how close is the phase to an odd multiple of 180? And it's this far above 180. All right, so it's about 20 degrees or so above. So you have now you have a 20-degree phase margin in your closed loop, not the open loop. I'll keep boring you with emphasizing that. In the root locus, we enter into the argument of our locus, not the closed loop. Well, some of you did. But you're supposed to enter the open loop, g of s, because what the root locus does is it solves the equation g of s equals -1, which means 1 plus g of s is 0, which means you're looking at the denominator of the closed loop. So just in the same way with the root locus, we have an open loop Bode plot, but we get the closed loop phase margin from that thing. So what we want to do, started doing it last time, is we want to incorporate a compensator that goes to this frequency or near it and says, oh, I want a 45-degree phase margin. I only have a 20-degree phase margin. I need my compensator phase to peak out at 25 degrees. Because when you multiply that, you add phases, right? Rho e to the I theta of 1 times rho 2 e to the I theta 2 is rho 1 rho 2 times e to the I theta 1 plus theta 2. Remember that? If you're unclear or still queasy about complex numbers, this is your first real, for many of you, it's your first real course in engineering in hardcore complex numbers. Not complex analysis, that's a whole different ballgame, but in complex numbers. So do you see why phases add when you multiply complex numbers? Do you see why decibels add when you multiply complex numbers? Why? Yeah, you're here. I can ask you now. You never show up these days anymore. I thought you ditched me. Why do you add decibels? Why do you add decibels when you multiply two magnitudes? They're what? Rhythmic? Logarithmic. Oh, logarithmic. So can you elaborate?
You have log of one thing plus the log of another thing. It's the same time.
You got it. You just said it backwards. It's the same thing as the log of the one thing times the other thing.
Yeah.
The log of AB is the log of A plus the log of B. You've just got mathematical dyslexia. I have circular dyslexia. So yeah, okay? So, all right, that's where we ended up. The problem with this thing is, if I put my compensator here, now I know the center frequency. There were two design equations. One design, these are the related equations for placing, where do you want that compensator to be? So the equations that we arrived at last time were omega max is equal to the square root of omega 1, omega 2, and phi max is equal to 1 plus sine alpha over 1 minus sine alpha, where alpha I defined as omega 2 over omega 1. And then the third equation was m at omega max in dB is alpha dB over
2.
So what happens when you place a compensator, and what I mean by placing a compensator is you choose the center frequency of that phase. Remember that phase is logarithmically symmetric? It's got that nice hump in the middle like that. So the center of it is where you say, that's my placement frequency. That's where I'm going to put it. Okay, so where you put it, what happens where you put it is you get this increase in phase, this amount of increase in the phase, and we want about a 25-degree increase, don't we? If we put this thing here, where the gain crossover is now 0, we're going to get 25 degrees. So this will go from 20 up to 45, and you can say, oh, problem done. Except, why isn't the problem done? Why isn't the problem done? Is the gain margin, or is the phase margin now 45 degrees? Really? How do you define the gain margin? You go to where the gain crosses over 0 dB. It did cross over 0 dB here. It did. But when you put your compensator here, this got added alpha dB over 2. It's no longer the crossover. Crossover went out here. Because the whole thing gets raised up by that amount. So now you say, oh, well, as I said in the book, and I didn't bring the book with me, after some trial and error, here's what we got. So that's what got me motivated to go to giving you, and I'm really not a fan of cookbooks, but I also know that this stuff can be really, really frustrating. Especially if you're not real comfortable with it, because you end up spending hours on this stuff and feeling like I really don't know what I'm doing, because you're not really secure in your understanding, and I don't want to take hours of your time. So I decided to do a cookbook. So here's what we went through last time. Okay? We went through all those derivations, gave you this example, and then I said, here, and this is the material in these set of notes that I just posted. This is called phase compensation 3.7, as in today. I could have appended it to the other one that I already had posted with these, but I decided I was going to make you a set of new notes, except I didn't get rid of the old ones. So the first part of those old notes that I just went through last week, that's what we spent the last 2 lectures on. They're in another one, and they're also in here. And I apologize, I didn't have the time to clean things up and make it really simple for you. But it's here. So let's go through the steps then. These are the steps that I came up with. And we'll see how they do as compared to simply trial and error. Which I love that. It's like if you know what you're doing, sure. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be trialing and erroring for months. So here's the idea. Okay? When you're using a compensator to modify the phase, which is what we're talking about now, we want to jack up the phase by about 25 degrees. So the first thing you do in order to achieve is to achieve a given, so we're specifying a phase margin. In in example 6.5 in the book, they say they want a closed loop 45-degree phase margin. So first you say, how much phase do you want? Okay, so we're doing the compensator for phase adjustment. Step 1, compute the current phase margin. All right, the current phase margin. This is the desired phase margin. Okay, so let's compute the current phase margin. We already did it in one way, but it was a really kind of, there. So here's the open loop system before we start designing the compensator. How did we get the phase margin? We went to where the open loop gain crossover was 1, and we read how much above negative 180 is the phase. There's an easier way to do it. I didn't want to tell you that until you knew how to do it by yourself. Anybody know the command for this? Who said that? Were you really working last week on this? All right then. Sorry to hear that. Margin. M-A-R-G-I-N-G-P. There it is.
Whoa.
Phase margin is 18 degrees. What does it mean that the actual phase is right here? It's minus 162. It's 18 degrees above or away from negative 180, which is good. Right? Remember, the warning lights go on if the open loop at a given frequency, at a given single frequency, has a magnitude of 1 and a phase of 180. That's root locus criteria for a closed loop root. That means I omega is a closed loop root. It means you're screwed because you're on the imaginary axis. So we're not screwed here. This is 18 degrees away, but it's not sufficiently far away. We want it to be 45 degrees away. So that's step one. Figure out where the current open loop system, what the closed loop equivalent phase margin would be, step one. All right? Are you clear on that? Step two, compute, and then what I say here is a cushion. And that cushion, you know what a cushion is? Like a whoopee cushion? Not exactly a whoopee cushion. A factor of safety, as it were. Although a whoopee cushion could be a factor of safety if there were nails under the cushion. Think of it. No, you have a very hard canvas on the bottom. You're not going to pop that. So then what you do is you say, okay, it's 18 degrees, I want 45 degrees. What's the difference between 45 and 18? 27. Okay? So if I add 27, yeah, at that frequency I'm going to bump things up, but the gain crossover is going to move to the right where the phase is more negative. This phase is dropping. So you say, I want a cushion. I want a factor of safety. So what I did is I said, 5 degrees. Let's try 5 degrees. 3, 4, just keep it simple. Try 5-ish degrees, 5, 10. It depends on how fast the phase is dropping, right? If the phase is moving very mildly downward, when you move out a little bit more because of that bump in the gain, you're not going to be that much different than you were here. You'll be down a little bit, but maybe only a couple degrees down. But if the phase is dropping real rapidly and you move over to the right, you might have to add a 20 degrees padding. And it gets worse from there. So that's step one. Step two, so what I did in the example, we'll go through the example, but I want to go through the steps here to make sure you understand the steps. So you find out Pmax and then add a few degrees to it. Typically 5 is just the lazy guy's number. Well, why not 3.5? Because I really don't care. I just want to see if this thing's going to have any chance of working. So you add a cushion to it, and then for that Pmax with a cushion on it, you compute an alpha from that equation, right? That's one of your design equations. Alpha is 1 plus sine Pmax. Well, actually, that was the wrong way around. This is the equation you want. This makes no sense because you don't take sines of non-angles. I told you it's my circular dyslexia. Whatever that means. There. So you've got a Pmax candidate, right? In our case, it's now 32 degrees, isn't it? Because it was 27, but we added 5. So we stick that 32 degrees in and we compute an alpha. And once you've computed alpha in step 2, you then compute the frequency at which you are currently at negative alpha dB over 2. Why? Because if I put my compensator at that frequency, knowing that my compensator is going to raise things by alpha dB over 2, it becomes my gain crossover. Right? Remember, when you multiply compensators, you add decibels. So if you know the compensator is going to add at VP, it's going to add alpha dB over 2. Wherever you put it, it's going to add that. So if you put it where you're currently minus alpha dB over 2, and it adds alpha dB over 2, you get 0 dB, which is the gain crossover frequency. So that's step 2. Find out where that omega naught is, where you're currently at negative alpha dB over 2, because you computed alpha from step 2. And again, I tell you why there. The next step is to compute the open loop phase of the new system with the compensator. So remember, when you put a compensator in there, phases add. So we had the old phase, that was minus 162, right? Because it was 18 degrees above minus 180. Minus 162, plus my new phi max, which is 32 degrees, because I added 5 degrees to my 27 degrees, or whatever it was. And so you get this. And then you say, how far is what's my phase margin now? Remember, if this thing is suppose this is minus 150 at the gain crossover. If it's negative 150 at the gain crossover, then you get the phase margin by saying 180 minus, this should be plus, shouldn't it? That should be plus, because this is going to be a negative, isn't it? This is a negative phase usually. So this really should be a plus. You want to get the difference between 180, negative 180, and where you are. I forgot that in English, so let me change that right now. So this is plus. And if it works, if your resulting phase margin here is roughly 45 degrees, mission's accomplished. You're done. If it's unacceptably low, it's not nearly close to 45 degrees, then what you do is you go back to 1 and try a bigger cushion. See if that'll work. So let's just go through these steps. You can study these steps and meditate on them more when you get home, but let's go through this example with the steps. This is what we were doing already. So what I did here is I actually plotted the open loop voltage, just like I showed you before, 10 over SS plus 1. That's the open loop. I then used the margin command to see what the current phase margin is. Current phase margin is 18. I want 45. Okay? So how much do I need? 18 to 45 is 27. But I added 5 more. All right? So I have 32 degrees for phi max. And then I compute my alpha. Computing alpha gives you 3.25 as alpha. So alpha dB is 10 and a quarter dB. Alpha dB over 2 is minus 5 dB. All right, so we go, then you take your data cursor and you go to where you are currently at negative 5 and a quarter dB. Because if you put your compensator there, you're going to get that 5 and a quarter from the compensator. It's going to bump it up by alpha dB over 2. So I use my thing, 5 and a quarter. Again, this is the data cursor thing. I can only get close without losing patience, and then I give up. I don't have the tactile sensitivity. In fact, I don't have much of any sensitivity. My wife told me. All right, so there it is. At this frequency, I'm down 5. Compensator's going to raise 5. That's the alpha dB over 2. Boom. There's my omega naught. There's where I'm going to try to put my compensator. So I use this omega naught. Okay. Go to where the omega naught is now, and here now, remember here I was at negative 162 originally. Now you see what's happened? I've dropped by 5 degrees because the phase is going down and I moved out to the right. So I dropped by a 5, but ha 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 ha, I added 5 too, knowing that I was going to drop by a 5. And you know what? One iteration, no trial and error. I got lucky. It works. So there's what you get. You're now at minus 187, You add 32. You're now at minus 135. How far above minus 180 is 135? 45 degrees. Well, there you have it. That's my phase margin requirement. So it took one iteration with this method. It's much better than simply starting at the frequency and ignoring that alpha dB over 2, designing it and then going back and trying again and again. Go to where you're currently down by alpha dB over 2, because you know that if you put it there, it is going to be the 0 dB crossing. So this is what you end up getting for the compensator in a single iteration. All right? So again, this is posted, study it, but it's the only place I've found that you get a rational sequence of steps rather than a simple encouragement to try, and if you try enough times, you'll probably get something. All right? So now what we're going to do, and I didn't have time to get this finished because I've been doing other stuff too, is we're going to see why 45 degrees? What is so impressive about 45 degrees? So how are we going to analyze why 45 degrees? Well, remember, we already had proportional control in this system. The steady state error requirement demanded that we multiply the 1 over s plus 1 by 10. That's proportional control, right? Proportional control was this. So the steady state error required this feedback system. The ESS requires this. This is the controller. Okay? There's the closed loop system. That'll satisfy the steady state error. But there was a second spec. And the second spec was we wanted a 45 degree phase margin. Why? Well, let's look at the closed loop step response and see what it looks like without that second spec. So let's do this. And remember, my GP now is 10 times this. So I don't have a GC. I took that 10 and put it right here, right away, just like the authors do in the example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say W1 equals feedback GP1. Step W1. And there it is. We do achieve the steady state error requirement, but there's an obvious undesirable property there. There's a lot of oscillations. So that's what the phase margin is intended to do. So let's enter our controller numbers here. It was omega 1 is 2.33. And omega 2 is 7.58. Oh. Funny watching people who don't know how to type in there. We call that bullying rock. Yeah, right. All right, and then alpha is omega 2 over omega 1. So here's my controller. GC equals alpha. Let's see, I'm going to make it a transfer function. TF. The numerator is alpha times what? 1 plus S plus omega 1, which is 1 comma omega 1. 1 comma omega 1. And the denominator is what? 1 comma omega 2. Okay? All right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hold on. W2 equals feedback GC times GP, unity feedback, that's 1. And now I'll say step W2 in red. So you can see that changing the phase margin of the closed loop can do some really nice things to the system. Okay, not only did we reduce oscillations, but we got a much faster settling time. Okay, the question though becomes, where did this 45 degrees come from? Okay, so what we're going to do next time, if not on Friday, is we're going to get into what's called the Nichols chart. Now, the authors are not big on the Nichols chart. The Nichols chart is going to give us a closed loop perspective on choosing the phase. Because it really is iffy. You can have 3 different control people. One will say, I want a 45-degree phase margin. One will say, I want a 60-degree phase margin. And one will say, oh, I'm 30 degrees. That's fine with me. And you're like, where are these numbers coming from? Well, it's my experience. So, see you guys next time.